Alright, welcome back. This is a homework video for von Thunen and landscape manipulation. So you got to take notes on this before we come into class. Now we have spent some time learning about all the different agricultures in the world and where they are today. So now we're going to get into a little bit of the historical side of agriculture and where we place these types of agriculture in relation to cities. And this is, our theory about von Thunen. So von Thunen's model, this circle. Definitely draw it in your notebooks. This theory, or this model, is based on the idea that land is flat, there's no rivers or anything, like perfect space. And we have the urban center, or the market, in the center. And we are going to place the appropriate agriculture around it, certain agricultures being further away, certain agricultures being closer, based on the amount of land that they need for that agriculture. Is it intensive or extensive? Based on the cost of transportation. Is it something that can expire? Is it something that's heavy? And he basically came up with this idea on where we place agriculture, and we still follow somewhat of this today. Now, what this is all based on, and I mentioned it, is the cost of getting your product there, and it's called the bid-rent curve. And what we also consider not just the cost of transporting your good, but the cost of land. Because if we have a type of agriculture that is extensive and needs lots of land, you're not going to want to be near the city because that's where you're going to have the most expensive land. Whereas if you're an intensive agriculture, you can afford to be near the city because you don't need a lot of land. You wouldn't want to be far away. But we'll talk more about specifics in class. And I know this picture is super blurry, but what we can do with the von Thunen model is that we can apply it to the United States. We can lay it out over the US and see that we have these different types of agricultures near our population center, if that would be New York. And how it works is that what's closest to the city center are things that expire, right? Things that are intensive land, so it doesn't require a lot of land, and they expire quickly. So dairy, market gardening, these are the things that we're going to keep close to city centers because we know that they expire, they're expensive to transport, and they use not a lot of land. Whereas if we move further away from the city center, we move out and we start seeing corn and soybeans, we start seeing wheat, beef and cattle, sheep. Those are extensive agricultures. It's taking up lots and lots of land, and it's cheap land, so it can be away from the city center, and it's cheap enough to transport. So, like I said, von Thunen is just figuring out what the order of agriculture should be from a city center. So we know where the farms go, but how do we organize the land? Because we can say, like, okay, dairy farmers are close to the city, vegetable gardeners are close to the city, but if you grow corn, if you're a cattle rancher, you're going to be further away from the city. But we need to organize that land for those farmers so they don't get in, fights with each other. So there's three ways we do it. One of the ways is the metes and bounds. Metes used to measure short distances, and bounds cover large areas. It's a very strange system, but you're going to see an example of each one. Townships and sections is a little bit easier, much more straightforward. This is splitting land into 6-mile wide long plots and dividing them into square mile sections. So this is like acres, the grid system, real easy and straightforward. And then we have the French long lot system, which are long, thin strips of land that all have access to water so they can trade and trade in crops. For trading crops, yes. They need the water for the crops, but also have that access to water to trade. Here's some examples of each one. So this is metes and bounds. Metes and bounds, it's strange because it's using landmarks to decide what the boundaries are of land. Whereas something like the township and range is very simple because it's a grid of land, and we know what belongs to who. And then finally, what you're seeing here is the long lot system, and if you look, they're long, thin strips of land, but they all have access to that body of water, which is the Mississippi River. So it makes it fair for all those farmers. They can all trade from their farm. So we know where farms go, we know what type of agriculture goes where, and we know how to divide up land between the farmers, but what happens if the landscape isn't perfect for the farmers? What can we do? Well, we touched on this a little bit earlier when we started agriculture, and I talked about terracing, and we talked about possibilism, and it's making its way here again. So the first thing we do if the land's not perfect for farming is terracing, creating flat surfaces on the side of mountains, right? Because mountains, you can't grow anything on that. Rainwater slides right off the side of mountains. So if you make it flat or have steps to a mountain, the land or the rainfall can collect in those. It can sustain crops. It stops soil erosion. You could stop mudslides. But if it's not maintained, it does cause mudslides, apparently. Now, this takes place predominantly in East Asia with rice farming, but it also happens in North Africa and South America. And you don't need to know, I would say you need to know where it originated, and it's definitely the rice farming in East Asia. And it has diffused across the world, but you don't need to know all the examples across the world. But it helps to understand what terracing is. And here are some pictures, some examples of said terracing. But what else? Say we don't have water. Well, we got to overcome that, and we have irrigation. We're going to divert water from its natural course or location and aid to production of crops. In the top right-hand corner, you're seeing the earliest irrigation systems of Mesopotamia, the Fertile Crescent, just simply digging them into the ground. But as we kept advancing, in the bottom left-hand corner, you see the 19th and 20th century aqueducts that were started by the Romans. And then, of course, in the bottom right, we have our modern-day irrigation, which is sprinkler systems, right? But we're seeing, too, that these types of sprinkler systems generally get water from the ground, not from a river far away. And by digging up all of this groundwater, you can eventually cause issues like salinization, the mixing of the salt in the ground mixing with water, and then you can't use that to water your crops because it'll kill them. Or it'll create, you take out all the water beneath the soil and it'll actually collapse the land. So we have to understand that our manipulation of the environment does have some consequences. Say a large amount of soil is wetlands. Well, in Florida, we drain those wetlands. And after draining those wetlands, it creates a huge amount of super nutrient-rich soil that we can use to farm. And it can increase the carrying capacity of the land. But by draining wetlands, we are threatening the biodiversity of the state, of the area, of plants, of animals that could have adverse effects. We also have deforestation. If there's trees in the way of your farming, you got to cut them down. Now, obviously, we know the dangers of cutting down massive amounts of trees, and deforestation can ultimately lead to desertification, where the soil becomes essentially barren and has no nutrients in it, and you can't grow anything. Now, this mainly happens in rainforests. We're seeing a lot of it in Brazil. We're seeing a lot of it in the African rainforests. And highly critical because these places are cutting down all of these trees, and we know these trees are super important to the rest of the world. And they are replacing it with ranching and things like that can speed up desertification. So what do you need to know today? You need to know, why do we follow von Thunens' theory for placement of agriculture relative to the urban center? And then once we establish the order of agriculture, how do we divide the land between the farmers? You should know the 3 different ways. And then finally, how does environmental possibilism play a role in agriculture and said farm placement? If you can answer all of these things, you are more than prepared. If you have any questions, make sure to write them down in your notes or highlight something in your notebook to bring it up in class when you see me.